apex, realize there is still plenty of corner left, and then say, crap, I way overslowed that one. The slow point of the corner glance helps our brains calm down and realize the turning point isn't the end of the deceleration zone. It's just the turning point, and there is still plenty of corner left. You won't always be able to see your exact slow point of the corner reference point as this section of the corner. For example, pretty much any car. That makes the slow point of the corner rather useless to have, so I just remove that reference point in these corners. Part 2. Using fundamentals to find the limit. Chapter 6. Finding the limit. You ready to get into the fun stuff? I sure am. Before we get any further, I want to answer one question right away. To find the limit of my car, do I have to be willing or accept the fact that I will crash? No. There is a systematic way to slowly work up and even a little bit past the limit without crashing. This is what we are going to cover in part 2 of this book. Yes, we do need to go over the limit, but when done right, that results in a missed apex, not a crash. Executing this will require a strong understanding of the fundamentals that we covered in part 1. Discipline, consistent coaching from a qualified source, and patience. But it's possible for anyone to safely work their way up to the limit. Finding the limit of a race car comes down to the combination of using our visual references, feel references, car control, and getting enough seat time to practice. In Chapter 2, we covered all 5 of our visual reference points on the racetrack. As race car drivers, it's important for us to develop feel references as well. What are feel references? Feel references are segments of the corner that are focused on our inputs and how the car felt with our manipulations. By breaking the corner up into more segments, we can hone our focus even further into specific segments of the corner. The segments that make up our feel references are first 50 feet of deceleration, last 50 feet of deceleration, direction change, turn in, slow point of corner, first 20% of throttle application, full throttle point. What you'll find as we progress through our conversation is we work our way up to finding the limit of the car segment by segment in the corner. These feel references will relate directly back to our visual references. In fact, the slow point of the corner is both a feel and visual reference point for us. Before we start diving into the process of finding the limit, I do want to touch on car control, as that is a vital part of this. I'm not going to spend too much time covering car control in this section, as plenty has been written about this already. But if this is something that you struggle with, I would recommend trying as many of the following things as you can. Put new tires on the front and put the oldest or crappiest tires you can find in the rear. Go turn some laps. Try a rally school like Dirtfish, skid pads, or find an open parking lot and just go do some donuts, hopefully in a legal way. I find the new and old tire technique is probably the best simulation you can have because you're driving on a real racetrack and you're likely dealing with oversteer in a much more natural way. My issue with skid pads is that we are purposely trying to induce and keep the slide. That's the opposite of what we want at the racetrack. That being said, I do think they are still a helpful tool and should be used, but they are maybe over-focused on the community. Finally, you're probably thinking to yourself, how does playing around doing donuts help with racing? There is no direct relation here. That being said, I can always immediately spot the confidence in the driver that has just played around and experimented with the car, and the driver that is not. The confidence of knowing what getting the car sideways feels like and that you can handle it will help you on track. So in case you needed another excuse to go out and do some donuts, you have my permission and encouragement. 6.2. Finding the limit, working up to the limit. us to find the limit, we need to get a feel for the maximum amount of lateral or longitudinal G's our car can pull, aka how much grip we have in braking and in turning. How do we find that maximum level of grip in the lowest risk way? The last thing we want to do is to try and find this maximum level of grip in the middle of a high-speed corner. That is where we have the least amount of margin for error and the highest risk. We need to pick the right areas to experiment with first. When I want to work my way up to finding the limit, I start with the first 50 feet of deceleration. I don't do this in every corner. I pick a specific corner to experiment in. I find the corner with the most amount of room, which is hopefully a bigger brake zone as well. I know I'm going to make some mistakes as I work toward finding the limit, and I'm going to experiment with going over the limit. I want to lower the risk here as much as possible by picking the lowest risk corner to do this. Slow speed corners with a good amount of run-up area is exactly where I want to start. My first area of focus is going to be on working on building up to more and more peak brake pressure until I start to get into the ABS, or I start to lock up tires if I'm driving something without ABS. What I'm doing is building a feel reference for how much grip I have in braking or longitudinal G-force. What you'll find is race cars have a very similar maximum level of grip in brake zones as it does in the corner. For example, a car that has a maximum grip level of 2 Gs will pull 2 Gs in threshold brake, as well as pull 2 Gs when at the limit while carving through a corner. Our bodies are pretty incredible at feeling that maximum G-force in braking, and then translating that to feeling the maximum level of grip mid-corner. This is one of those core feel references that we will use again and again. It's important to note that while I'm using a numeric number to represent G's, I'm doing that to make a point. I don't look down while I'm braking to see how many G's I am pulling mid-brake zone and use that number to determine how quickly I can go through the corner. I'm more just feeling the load on my body, what the car feels like below me, to get an understanding of roughly how much grip I have. If I start building up to peak brake pressure, hit the ABS before I expect it to, I know the grip is a little bit lower than I anticipated. That will change not only where I brake, but also how much entry speed I'll be rolling into a corner. If you haven't gotten into the ABS or locked up tires in your car yet, you need to experiment with this. Throw out looking at lap times for a session and focus purely on picking one corner and hitting the brakes harder and harder until you experience ABS or lockups early in the brake zone, the first 30% of the brake zone. Once you have found the maximum level of braking grip, it's time to find the limit in the corners. But before I can find the limit of the car, I have to know what my objective even is. This leads us to the next two feel and visual references I use to help find and stay at the limit. The following two areas are the most important references we use as race car drivers: minimum speed in the corner, full throttle application zone. My goal is to build up to the limit at corner exit first, then build up to the limit mid-corner, and finish up by finding the limit in late range. This is the lowest risk way to find the limit. We're going to use where minimum speed comes, where we pick up throttle as the foundation for building up to the limit. When you see a pro driver have the ability to change their mid-corner speed by just 1 mph from lap to lap, it's because they are making changes based on these two core reference points. If you did your homework correctly from Chapter 2, before you ever turn a lap, you should know roughly where you want your minimum speed to come in every corner of the track. The relationship between where our minimum speed comes, our car position at corner apex, and where we get back to full throttle is how we slowly work up to the limit, and even step over the limit in a small enough way that should not result in a crash. As I start building speed, I start by purposely arriving into corners slowly, within reason, and I do not let that change where I pick up the throttle or where the minimum speed in the corner comes. first goal is to see how hard I can accelerate back up to full throttle after the minimum speed in the corner. I'm playing with my car angle of the apex and traction to see how quickly I can go from 0% to 100% throttle. Only once I get my car angle figured out and find the exact spot at corner exit that I can work back to full throttle do I start building entry speed. I now have the following feel and visual reference points. 1. Where my minimum speed comes. 2. Where I get back to full throttle. 3. My exit apex reference. 4. My apex point. And 5. The angle of the car at apex. Now that I have these reference points, it's time to start building in entry speed to find the limit in the first half of the corner. The way I approach this is by working on my brake release before I work on braking later. Late braking is where we increase the risk the most, so it's the last thing I work on. Instead, in phase 2 of finding the limit, I work on releasing off the brakes earlier. I'm not worried about the perfect trail breakdown in the apex yet. I'm more worried about increasing entry speed and then perfecting the details after. So, what do we do at this point? We start releasing off of relative peak brake pressure in the corner earlier and earlier, which will naturally bring our speed up at entry. We know where we want our entry speed to come. We know where we want to apex, we know the car angle we need at apex, and we know where we need to get back to full throttle. Now we need to slowly build in entry speed until the point we can no longer execute on any one of those priorities. Little by little, I want to roll in more and more entry speed until one of the following things happen. My minimum speed point of the corner comes later than where I want it to. I can no longer get back to full throttle where I want to. I miss the apex, or I can't get the car to get the right angle at the apex. Once one of the things on this list happens, I know I have now stepped over the limit, and it's time to back it back down slightly. When we do this correctly, stepping over the limit causes us to maybe miss the apex by a little bit, or get back to full throttle just a little bit too late. We lose a couple tenths of a second, but we aren't putting the car at risk of crashing in search of it. Now, the list of references I have is 1. Where my minimum speed comes. 2. Where I get back to full throttle. 3. My exit apex reference. 4. My apex point. 5. The angle of the car at apex. And 6. How much speed I can have at the minimum speed part of the corner. The final thing for me to do is find a limit in the braking zone. When we are working towards finding the limit in this section of the corner, we typically have one limiting factor, the amount of brake pressure we can have past the turning point. Refer back to Chapter 4 if you need a refresher on braking. As I work toward finding the limit in the braking zone, I am taking 3 feel and visual references into account. 1. My initial braking zone. 2. Brake pressure wanted at the turning point. 3. Where I want my end of braking zone. The end of my braking zone is determined by the balance of the car and the angle I want to apex. Typically in higher grip scenarios where a car is well balanced, my end of brake zone will be deeper into the corner. But when grip suffers, I will have an earlier end of brake zone and a longer coast speed. Similarly, grip is what determines how much brake pressure I can have at or past the turning point. To find this limit, I slowly work my initial brake zone deeper and deeper into the corner. Before I begin braking deeper and deeper, I first establish how I want to brake in the first half of the corner. That means I know what I want my peak brake pressure to be, and I roughly know how I want to release off the brakes in the second half of the corner. By establishing this before working on braking later, I limit the variance. I don't want to be working on braking deeper and changing how I brake. Now that I'm finally ready to start braking deeper, I do this extremely slowly, and I make sure I am using my reference points. I find one of the most common misconceptions with braking market reference points is that drivers forget to treat them just as a point to judge your braking zone. When I am approaching a braking zone, let's say I use the 400 point as a braking marker, I do not think to myself, I need to brake at the 400 point. Instead, I think of where I'm braking relative to the 400 point. Did I feel like I overslowed the last lap? Let me be full throttle until I'm parallel with the 400 port and then brake. Still feel like I'm overslowing? Let me get full throttle until my whole car passes the 400 port and then brake. I continue to do this until I no longer feel like I am overslowing. If I feel like I broke too deep, I would back up my brake zone relative to the 400 port. It's a nuanced difference, but one that is vital. As I work towards braking deeper, I typically move my brakes around one car length in minutes, and I'm able to do that by having a strong reference point. I work my brake zone deeper and deeper into the corner until one of the following things happens. One, I feel like I can't turn in at my normal spot because I have too much brake pressure or too much speed. This typically feels like you all of a sudden lack the confidence to turn because you feel like the car may snap to oversteer. 2, my end of brake zone happens later than I want it to. 3, I now have too much speed at the minimum speed part of the corner, or my minimum speed starts coming too late. 4, I begin to lock up tires or get into ABS late in the brake zone because I can't release off the brakes enough in the second half of the brake zone. Once one or multiple of these begins to happen, I know I'm starting to edge my way over the limit. At this point, I back up my brake zone to the point just before the unwanted feeling starts. My end of brake zone will be something I adjust based on what I need to get the car angle I want to the apex point. Typically, the later into the corner my end of braking comes, the more rotation I get and the sharper the angle I get of the car at the apex. There are exceptions to the rules where the opposite happens, and that is related to overloading the front tires. As I work on building entry speed, I will adjust my end of braking to try and get the car angle I need. When I can no longer get that angle I need at apex, where my end of brake zone comes, I have a sign that I'm starting to creep over the limit. Now, you have found the limit at corner exit, mid-corner, corner entry, and in your braking zone. By working backward, you know your priorities, you have strong reference points, and you slowly and safely work your way up to and past the limit before working it back down to right at the limit. The more you work on this process, the more exact you'll be able to get with your inputs. You often see pro drivers making small 1 to 3 mph changes in their speed at a specific point of the corner. They're able to do that because they have these reference points. With enough practice, you will be able to refine your driving to make smaller and smaller adjustments. So if you feel like your variance is too wide early on, don't worry. With enough practice and feedback from your coach, that will naturally improve with more seat time. 6.3. Finding the limit, it's not a one-and-done process. Unfortunately, the limit of your car at a given corner is not a static point. The limit changes and is influenced by things like weather, tire wear, setup, etc. The process of finding the limit is something we are constantly working on every few laps as race car drivers. For example, during the Sebring 12 hour, the race goes from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. The difference between the ambient temperature and cool mornings and cool nights compared to the middle of the day can be as much as 20 degrees Fahrenheit. When the ambient temperature is 20 degrees higher than when you last drove, the limit is likely going to be lower. Obviously, this depends on what the starting temperature is, but in Florida, the middle of the day gets extremely cold, so grip suffers during the middle of the race. Even the grip from the start of the stint when the tires are new and the fuel tank is full will be different than mid-stint or at the end of the stint. Professional race car drivers are continually working on the loop we discussed in the previous section of finding the limit. We are constantly adjusting brake points, brake release points, and full throttle points based on the grip we have. For example, my initial brake point, my brake release point, my full throttle point, and my car positioning out of Turn 10 at Sebring International Raceway is quite different in the middle of the race than the beginning or end. Turn 10 leads into nearly flat-out turns 11 and 12. My priority through Turn 10 is to set up for these corners. When grip is high, I have an easier time staying flat through 11 and 12, which means I don't have to sacrifice as much speed on Turn 10. When grip is high in Turn 10, I can get away with more brake pressure past the turning point, and my end of brake zone can stretch closer down to the apex point. But as the sun starts to warm the track up and I lose grip, the first thing I notice is the car can't handle the same amount of brake pressure at the turning point, and the rear starts to slide. That is when we begin slowly backing up our initial brake zone to come earlier and earlier. As the sun begins to set, the opposite happens. The track surface cools down and things start to grip up. We start to be able to have more grip at the turning point, which allows us to brake deeper and carry more brake pressure past the turning point. As turns 11 and 12 become easy flat out again, I start to roll more speed at my minimum speed in Turn 10 and let the car use more track out of Turn 10 before turning into 11. Notice how I am using the feel reference of the turning point, combined with a deep understanding of the corner priority, to determine when I need to adjust my driving to find the limit. Now, let's use some image comparisons to see the differences in real life. 6.4. Finding the limit. An example with my driving. Let's take a look at some real-life examples to show you the exact differences in my driving between the first laps I turned in a new car on a new track compared to my fastest lap in the car on that track later that day. The images below will show you the difference between my first laps in a new car on a new track compared to my driving about 10 laps later when I was comfortable. The car is a Lamborghini GT3 and the track was Podium Club in Arizona. For this example, the car and track do not matter at all. How I approach finding a limit remains the same in any car on any track. In the following images in your PDF, you will see a comparison at every vital point of the corner. The top image is from my first few laps in the car as I'm learning. The bottom image is from my fast lap that day. Page 121, full throttle application spot. Page 122, minimum speed location. Page 123, end of brake zone. Page 124, turning point. Page 125, initial braking point. When you look at the differences in each segment, you're going to notice the biggest differences come in the initial braking zone and the end of the braking zone. We're going to dig into each one of these in great depth, starting in the order in which I focus on. Let's begin by talking about my initial braking point. If you look closely, you will spot two major differences. 1. The fast lap, the bottom image, is braking one full board later. In the fast lap, I'm now braking at the 400 board, and in the top image, while I was getting a feel for the car, I was braking at 500. 2. I ramp up to peak brake pressure slightly slower than my fast lap. If you look at the pressures, I ramp up to 39 bar immediately in the top images, whereas in the bottom image, I'm only at 29 bar. This image is showing us what it looks like while I'm working on getting a feel for how much grip the car has in the brake zone. I'm purposely picking a very early brake zone, and I'm working on hitting the brakes harder and harder until I get into the ABS. In that top image, I am fully into the ABS, and I notice the car gets a little unsettled as I get into it. So, the adjustment I make is to back down my brake pressure ever so slightly. This is me working up to the limit, stepping a little bit over the limit, and then backing it down again. I picked turn 1 at this track, Podium Club in Arizona, to experiment with the brakes because it was the biggest braking zone with the most amount of runoff area. Remember, Braking deeper is the very last thing I work on when approaching the limit. As I get comfortable, I move my brake zone up a little bit so that it's not ridiculous, but gives me plenty of margin for error. Let's now move to the full throttle application zone on page 127. Let's dig into a couple of observations here. 1. The bottom image gets back to full throttle just slightly earlier than the top image. But in comparison to other areas we're comparing for this section, these two laps are very similar here. 2. There is an 11 kph difference in speed here. When I'm just building my way up to the limit, I don't care too much until I've figured out how to get back to full throttle where I want to get back to it.
Looks like it's good.
When starting the day off, I knew my goal was to work my way back to full throttle before my right front tire gets out to the exit curve. I didn't know how much grip I was going to have. As I develop a feel for how much grip I have in the brake zone, I will start experimenting with how much grip I have accelerating out of low-speed corners like this.